This episode is dedicated to Ali Al-Batati, a friend and dreamer and an avid listener of the podcast. He dreamed of justice and dignity for all. Please consider donating to the charity in his name in the description below. Welcome to episode 17 of the Tahrir podcast. My guest today is Dr. Dana Moss. Dr. Moss is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame. Her research investigates how authoritarian forces repress their critics and how collective actors resist this repression in a globalized world. She is also the founding director of the Yemen Peace Project. Her most recent publication and first book, The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes, published by Cambridge University Press in April of this year, 2022, investigates when diaspora actors mobilize, how they intervene, or what makes them effective. Drawing on over 230 original interviews, fieldwork, and comparative analysis, examining Libyan, Syrian, and Yemeni mobilization from the US and Great Britain before and during the revolutions, Dr. Moss presents a new framework for understanding the transnational dynamics of contention and the social forces that either enable or suppress transnational activism. Dr. Moss's book, The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes, is now a free and publicly accessible publication, which I leave the link to below in the description. And I highly recommend you grab yourself a copy. So welcome, Dr. Dana.
Shukran, Abdullah. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Glad to have you. So, Dr. Dana, to start, you're the founding director of the Yemen Peace Project. So, what is the Yemen Peace Project?
Thank you so much for bringing attention to that aspect of my past life. Unfortunately, the Yemen Peace Project, we shut our doors in 2019, but I'll explain a little bit about what we did and how the work has transitioned since then. So I was a founding member of the Yemen Peace Project, which was led full-time by my partner, Layla Picard. And what we were originally, the impetus to found the organization was inspired by the horrific attacks against civilians by US drone strikes and the sort of ongoing war on terror around 2009, 2010. And there wasn't very much attention to this issue at the time. My partner and I had spent some time in Yemen studying Arabic, seeing the country, meeting different activists. And we were just appalled at the fact that the United States was launching this undeclared war in Yemen, but Americans didn't know anything about it, couldn't even locate it on a map in many instances. So the idea was to found an organization that would educate Americans about Yemen, Yemeni art, Yemeni culture, film, and to bring a human face to this country that was associated oftentimes erroneously with terrorism and chaos and violence, but also to lobby policymakers to improve US foreign policy on Yemen, to try to make Yemen a litmus test to see where our congressional representatives stood in terms of human rights, in terms of their foreign policy. And even though we had to close in 2019 due to lack of funding, you can still see a lot of the work that we did on the website, yemenpeaceproject.org. So we worked with local partners in order to get information about the various conflicts going on. We worked a lot with revolutionaries and people who were on the ground protesting Ali Abdullah Saleh in 2011. And the director managed to get together the world's only Yemen International Film Festival, which ran for a couple years, getting exposure to local artists and Yemeni diaspora artists as well, photographers, filmmakers. For example, Sada Ishaq's Oscar-nominated short documentary film, Karama Has No Walls, on one of the major massacres that happened in 2011. So it was an unbelievable experience for me. I should say I probably benefited more than anyone because it overlapped with my research on the Yemeni diaspora. And through Yemen Peace Project engagement, having been to the country, having studied there, this helped me to really meet a lot of Yemenis, not just inside Yemen, of course, but all over the world, which led into my research, which I know we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So now to your research. So why did you start No, why did you want to write about diaspora and research the diaspora in specific?
Yeah, thank you. So anybody who had international fieldwork planned during the 2010-2011 time, and even now, right, with COVID, knows that sometimes you have to go to a plan B. I had originally expected to do my dissertation in Yemen to better understand activism and how it was playing out on the ground there. But ironically, the visa that I applied for in 2011 fell through because of the revolution. But you know, first and foremost, I'm a scholar of social movements, and I'd always wanted to study social movements in the region. Of course, getting to know Yemenis across, you know, the globe during this time through Twitter and just through our other contacts, I realized that, wow, the revolution really went global. The kinds of uprisings that happened in places like Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Libya, and elsewhere really inspired diaspora activists to mobilize in new ways, and then in turn try to assist revolutionaries, assist humanitarian relief efforts in ways that these community members were telling me they'd never really mobilized to this extent before in their history. And so I thought, well, this is a really interesting story, and it would make for a really interesting comparison as well to understand the different kinds of obstacles or sort of facilitating conditions, the different ways in which diasporas try to intervene in their home countries, try to, you know, change governance, try to help with humanitarian crises on the ground, but also to better understand what the obstacles are to doing so. I think a lot of times we think, oh, we live in a globalized world, everybody has the internet, it's so easy to connect, it's so easy to move resources around, it's so easy to wire money or whatever it is. But actually, activists who are on the outside of the Middle Eastern region in North Africa have a lot of challenges to helping their compatriots, staying connected at home. And we can talk about some of those challenges if you'd like as well.
Yeah, definitely. And your book draws on hundreds of hours of research, and you've even been to Yemen and Libya for that sake. So how are these trips? Like especially Libya,
Oh
because
yeah,
that was a very interesting time, 2013.
it really was. It really was. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. I'm working on a paper right now that's going to be explicitly talking about my experience and my really unique sort of view into Yemen and Libya when they were sort of finished the first phase of the revolution, but prior to the onset of the subsequent wars and conflicts that erupted in 2014. So it was a really unique time to be there because there weren't a lot of international white Westerners, Americans there at the time. You know, in Libya, it was sort of the post-Benghazi, Chris Stevens killing incident. And this has, of course, become very famous and infamous and politicized in American society. So going to Libya was absolutely astounding. I think we heard a lot about Gaddafi and his opulence. And, you know, my diaspora friends would tell me that, you know, he was sort of this mad clown that came to represent Libya and kind of overshadow what Libya was actually like. And so I went there, I was just astounded by the juxtaposition, for example, of some of the expensive hotels, you know, the 4-star hotels versus sort of the Italian colonial architecture versus the way everyday people were just living, grinding, you know, working, trying to make sense of what life would be like in this post-revolutionary context. I felt extremely welcomed. I felt extremely safe and looked after by various people that I met while I was there. You had to be careful though. As an American Westerner, I had plans to go to Benghazi, but then they fell through because the family that was supposed to take care of me couldn't do it. After all, they were experiencing an emergency. So then I was going to go to a hotel, but people didn't like that either. So I ended up basically staying in Tripoli and the surrounding kind of suburban areas and doing some sightseeing and visiting around there. It was just astounding. It was gorgeous. I can't wait to get back to Libya one day. But I will say I got lucky because a lot of the activists who I had planned to interview in Benghazi, who were, you know, had spent time in exile in the UK or in the United States, they actually would come through Tripoli quite often on business or to see family. So I ended up getting a chance to see many, many people that I would have missed otherwise. And I think it was important at that time to talk to people who had repatriated to Libya and who had planned to invest in a kind of new nation building, whether they were working in hospitals or running a nonprofit. Of course, a lot of those people came to be kind of pejoratively referred to as double chefras because they did have the ability to kind of leave again. And a lot of them were forced to during the conflict that emerged in 2014. So it was a very rare and beautiful insight, and I really treasure the time that I had there and very thankful to the people who made that possible. Yemen was similar in that all of a sudden, you had a sort of semi-regime transition from Ali Abdullah Saleh to Vice President Hadi during this transition period, but you had this remarkable opening of kind of civic space and civil society. A lot of the tents and the exhibitions that went up during the revolution were still intact and still being shown in 2012. Of course, just like in Libya, the places we could travel became smaller and more contained because of growing insecurity, threats to visitors, and so forth. But I was just literally in tears sometimes meeting activists who I'd been tweeting with during the revolution, who had survived, sniper attacks and other kinds of repression. To meet them in person was an absolute privilege. And it just goes to show sometimes you don't know when these windows of opportunity are going to open, and you don't necessarily know when they're going to shut again. So I don't know when I'll be able to go back, but I'm desperate to, because the connections we made there were truly, truly special.
Definitely. And what about field work in general? Because throughout reading your book, it was made clear that it was obvious about it was about the diaspora, so people abroad. So how
Right.
smooth was that process of like interviewing people abroad? Because it like as someone like part of a diaspora like the Syrian diaspora, for instance, it's really tricky to talk to someone, especially a researcher, about something that sensitive. So how was that experience like for you and for them?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think there was, in some ways, it was even in the early 2010s, before we had Zoom and all of this wonderful technology, making long distance communication so much easier. I'd say I was really fortunate that I was invited by key organizers to different communities in the diaspora, as well as in Libya and elsewhere, to come visit and meet people, because these folks were really, I couldn't have done my research without them. They were the sort of the brokers who were introducing me to various community members, helping me to orient who did what, who got along, who didn't, who formed a social movement organization, who did something on their own or more informally. And a lot of times we were interviewing during the Ramadan. So we'd have these big iftar dinners and we'd talk. And it was just, I felt very welcome. Of course, that had its own challenges too, because sometimes, I would spend my last, dollar as a graduate student to take the train from London to Manchester, hoping that so-and-so would be able to meet me, and then they'd be away on business. There are always like little logistical issues that come up when you're trying to do field work on a dime. But in general, it was really the activists themselves and the participants themselves who made it possible by giving me insights about where to go, who to visit. And also, but I do want to be careful to mention that I didn't just follow their advice. So I was doing alongside, in parallel, my own research to make sure that I sampled kind of across activist groups as much as possible. So talking to women as much as possible as men, speaking with different kinds of organizers and organizations, because, for example, like so many Syrians would be working on human rights, reporting, democracy projects in Turkey, humanitarian organizing in the United States, whatever it was. So I did my best to try to get all of the major actors who were involved, as well as a variety of different kinds of mobilizers, to get a sense of the full range of interventions that people were making into the revolutions.
Yeah. And thoroughly, what does your book add on the literature on the Arab Spring in general and the Arab diasporas and diasporas in particular?
Yeah, I think that the majority of the diaspora literature around the Middle Eastern region is really focused on the Lebanese diaspora and to some extent the Turkish diaspora. So, and really how influential they've become through their incorporation into formal institutions. So because the Lebanese diaspora has voting power, there's been some really interesting studies looking at their influence and sort of their sway, I guess, on domestic politics. And this has really been the orientation of the diaspora literature in general, which is that to say that, some of the literature talks about, well, what is a diaspora, and is very conceptual. I think the consensus these days is that we use it to refer not just to exiles and refugees, but to broader populations who go abroad for a variety of reasons, including to seek out better opportunities, not just because they've been repressed or thrown out of their homelands. And the other part of the literature has said, diasporas are increasingly incorporated into home country politics because they tend to send a lot of resources home, and because they can be very influential, states are actually trying to get them, incorporated into their systems of governance in order to kind of harness that power to keep remittances flowing, which is very interesting. But the authoritarian cases present a different set of challenges for diasporas, because it means that for a variety of reasons, they're either coerced into supporting the home country regime, or they're totally blocked from participating in home country politics in any meaningful way. And so what I found is that the Arab Spring not only had global effects, which I think really deserve a lot of attention in terms of mobilizing diasporas in new ways, but that the ensuing uprisings and conflicts gave them unique opportunities to try to influence the home country in ways that they hadn't been able to before because of regime repression and basic stability, essentially. So I found that they, intervened in a variety of ways, but not every diaspora was equally empowered to do so due to their degree of resources and their geopolitical support, which varied a lot. Libyans had a lot of geopolitical support to overthrow Gaddafi, and Syrians had far less in their prolonged struggle, and the Yemenis had very little say or support to implement, a kind of democratic system that they had envisioned. So, of course, the diaspora had this moment to reconnect with the home country, to mobilize for the homeland, to help their compatriots. And I'd say it was important because a lot of times people on the outside were actually coming back home to volunteer on the ground and save lives, working as volunteer doctors, journalists, humanitarian aid workers, and even revolutionaries themselves. But again, not every diaspora had an equal opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And in the book, you make it clear that you don't subscribe to Asif Bayat's notion of revolution with the F. And so can you make clear the difference and why you don't subscribe to his school of thought, if you want to call it that?
Sure. And Professor Bayat, I should say, is a personal hero of mine, and he is not only a brilliant scholar who knows so much about the region, but I would say he's also one of the nicest people on the planet. So I'm critiquing this idea, but not the person. Sometimes that gets conflated in academic circles. So that is to say, so Dr. Bayat has this idea in his Revolution Without Revolutionaries book that came out on the heels of many of the uprisings, that maybe part of the fatal flaw or one of the issues with the revolutions was that they weren't revolutionary enough. So in contrast to prior revolutions that were what academics would call social revolutions, that were very interested in imposing socialism or communism and really redoing and revamping and revolutionizing the economic system, his argument, as far as I understand it, is that because these revolutions are embedded in a kind of neoliberal global political economy, they were very much kind of conservative in the ways that they were calling for change. And essentially, my reading of what he's saying is, in short, they didn't call for enough economic change, so therefore they weren't truly revolutionary in the ways that we might think. Now, I have a number of sort of issues with this comment, although I completely understand where he's coming from. I would say that all revolutions carry with them a kind of hangover effect, shall we say. The institutions that precede them influence the kinds of revolutionary change that new governments can implement. And because of that, you have a hangover effect. So if you had a lot of sexism in your country or through governance prior to the revolution, you're still going to have a lot afterwards. Or if you had a lot of inequality in your system prior, you're still going to have a lot afterwards, right? Because revolutionaries can't just, dig the current system out of the ground and plant a new one that easily. They have to build on what's there before. So I think in all revolutions, even prototypical social revolutions that we've seen in Russia and China and Iran, we see that there are huge forms of inequality, particularly economic inequality, that continue as a kind of running thread. So in that way, I don't buy the argument essentially that a real revolution or a true revolution produces like sweeping economic change. I understand that he's talking about more what people are calling for. But on that note, I think that a lot of different participants in the various uprisings across the region did call for economic change, particularly in a call to the end of corruption, the availability for social services, for goods that they could afford. I think it was harder for them to find a model that might replace the current system because we don't have a kind of global subscription to socialism anymore, which was really perpetuated through Cold War politics in the Soviet Union, right? So I think it's hard to figure out what that looks like. But certainly I would say there were a lot of participants who were calling for economic reforms. And I think when we homogenize revolutions and we gloss over the variation in terms of what people are calling for, whether that's women's rights, minority rights, human rights, whatever it is, religious rights, then we risk mischaracterizing what people actually wanted and the diversity within revolutions. So in other words, it's easy to say, we know what the Bolsheviks wanted in Russia, right? They wanted social, political, and economic change. But the revolutions that happened across the Arab majority world were very much coalitions of different actors who wanted different things. And some of them were fighting for survival, not necessarily working towards some sort of grand ideologically undergirded utopia. So I think it can accidentally denigrate the kinds of sacrifices, the kinds of change that people were looking for, at least within these coalitions, to say that they weren't really revolutionary. And I worry that that proliferation of a sharp binary or distinction between revolutionary and revolutionary is going to kind of, what's the word, like downgrade what people actually wanted, what they were doing in order to try to create change on the ground. And so I don't find it very helpful, and maybe in the worst case it could be misleading. But I'm happy to talk with Dr. Bayat more about that. Again, I'll have coffee with him any day. But I think we can call them revolutionary. We might get confused over like, were they actual revolutions if they didn't succeed in implementing democracy? Well, okay, that's a separate question. But they were certainly revolutionary in character, and I think they showed the world what is possible. The stereotype of people in the Middle Eastern region, a lot of times from the West, is people are brainwashed, they're apathetic, they don't care, they're just trying to get by day to day. And we saw the exact opposite happening through all the sacrifices that people were making to try to help each other and try to instigate change. So I don't want to adopt any newfangled language that might downgrade that incredible series of events that we witnessed and people like me witnessed from the outside.
Yeah. And in your book, you also talk about transnational repression. So what do you think has been, can you name some methods in which authoritarian regimes were able to repress people abroad? And what do you think was the most effective method? And I hope no dictator is listening to this episode.
Seriously, right? Yeah, so thank you for bringing this up. Transnational repression is a term that I adopted in some of my earlier work in 2016 to refer to the ways that regimes repress their diasporas. And they're literally going outside their borders to keep an eye on refugees, migrants, students, and other people who they attribute to be theirs, right, who are living outside, who are residents, or whether temporary or permanent. So a lot of folks in the Syrian and Libyan diaspora specifically, but we're now seeing this among the diaspora from Russia, from various parts of China and elsewhere, is that the most effective thing that regimes can do to keep people silent abroad is to threaten their families. And they don't necessarily have to do this on an individual basis. Simply the knowledge by people in the diaspora that if you speak out on Facebook or Twitter or in person or at a speech, that your family, that your relatives at home could be punished for you doing that is oftentimes enough to deter people from, simply enacting their civil and political freedoms abroad to just say what's on their mind. And I found that this had a huge deterrent effect on whether people could speak out, whether people could mobilize prior to the revolutions in Libya and Syria. Specifically, most people were simply too afraid. They knew that there were informants embedded in their communities, that there were people monitoring their actions online. And if this might get you individually in trouble, it might put you on a blacklist, you might get your scholarship revoked, you might have threats against you. But in particular, for a lot of first and second generation people who are living abroad or staying abroad, their biggest concern was, will I ever be able to get back home to see my family, and will my family be safe? And so we see this as a growing tactic. The think tank Freedom House, which is based in Washington, D.C., has done a lot of really great research on this. And I'm working now on a book about transnational repression with my fellow social scientist, Sapira Furstenberg, because it is a growing problem. And we see this now even with Russia trying to intimidate people who are abroad and protesting the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine. So it's a growing problem. It's enabled by a lot of technology. As the technology gets better for us to connect and collaborate, so too does it get better for regimes to keep an eye on people abroad and threaten them and potentially repress them. So because this is a growing problem and not something that just impacted people prior to the Arab Spring in the few cases that I looked at, I think it's going to be a big issue and topic for people to be looking into in the future.
Yeah. And how big of a role do you think diasporas have played in Libya, Yemen, and Syria that you shed a light on in the book? Like, in other words, what are some of the ways in which they were pivoted or effective in supporting movements at home?
Yeah, so I find that particularly in the Libyan case and during select periods of time, in the Syrian case, less so in the Yemenis because they had more challenges, I found that diasporas played 5 major roles in these uprisings, which I'll just describe super briefly. The first one is broadcasting. So when people, for example, in western parts of Libya were trapped and under siege, didn't have access to the media, didn't have access to the internet, they oftentimes would physically call or Skype or Viber, with their relatives abroad to get out information. And then diaspora members would deputize themselves to fact check this information and publicize it on the web, publicize it and send this information to media organizations, for example, to policymakers, so that when people on the ground were being affected, but they couldn't get the word out themselves or they couldn't communicate in English, people in the diaspora would help to transmit this information. Another thing that they did is they represented the revolutions abroad. So a lot of times local revolutionary organizations and humanitarian groups that were working in their home country would say, we need you to represent us and go talk to people in Washington, D.C. or London or Paris or Rome, about what's happening. So they were deputized as kind of representatives of these revolutions. Another thing, of course, they did, which I hinted at already, is they brokered tremendously. So for example, I met a Syrian American activist who ushered the famous sort of 60-minute CBS News crew into his hometown of Homs. He literally brought them home and acted as a broker and an intermediary for outsiders who wanted to investigate what was going on, channel resources there, or help with the humanitarian effort. We certainly see this happening with Ukrainians, for example, who are trying to broker for outside help to channel inward. They also, of course, remitted a huge amount of resources to the revolutions, and that includes the Yemeni community, who are more socioeconomically disadvantaged in places like the United States. They tend to be channeled more into blue-collar work. But nevertheless, they also, a lot of times, people donated their entire savings to what was going on. And so we saw people, do everything from just send cash to buying satellite phones, buying, bulletproof vests, buying recorders for journalists, and diapers, food, medicine. I mean, the Syrian American Medical Society has done a phenomenal job, for example, of sending like trauma kits I met Syrians also from Britain who drove ambulances all the way through Europe and Turkey to get into liberated areas in Syria. So people remitted a huge amount. And the important thing too is not just the amount they remitted, which is hard to gauge. It's definitely in the millions of dollars, particularly for the Syrian crisis, probably for the Libyan as well, although we don't have the exact figures. But the important part about that is also diaspora members can channel in resources to places that the international community either can't get into or they won't get into because they're sort of like the Red Cross, for example, Red Crescent being hamstrung by rules set up by the regime in Syria, for example. So they can get money sometimes where other actors can't, and that's super important. And then, of course, the last thing that many people did was go back home to volunteer. And what was really beautiful was hearing these stories about youths who'd grown up in Jordan and then in the United States in exile, because their parents or their uncles had been active against Gaddafi. And then, they were coming home for the first time to help liberate their home country. And it was just such an incredibly moving experience for them to kind of have this homecoming where they really felt impactful. And when I visited a martyrs museum in Zawiya, Libya, there were actually pictures of a father and son from the United States who had died in the revolution, who had, returned home fighting. And of course I couldn't display that in the book because there's privacy issues involved. But the point is that a lot of times people did just flood back either into the home country or around the home country, like Syrian Americans, Syrian British people going to Turkey to try to help with the humanitarian response or training or what have you. So they can also offer not just their resources, but their labor and their actual skills on the ground, working with revolutionaries, working with organizers to try to help. So in that way, I found that the diaspora, I think, can perform at certain times and places really life-saving work and really movement sustaining support to their compatriots on the ground, particularly when revolutions always have to fight a kind of public relations campaign, right? They have to try to get international actors on their side, and diasporas can play a huge role in this. But I did find that, of course, because of transnational repression, because of the lack of geopolitical support that some groups get, research shortages, Yemenis, again, didn't necessarily have as much resources to lend. The Syrians certainly ran out of resources after a time, right, given the extent of the crisis. The resources can run out, and some of these other challenges can really make the opportunities to intervene very fragile and extremely contingent. So this idea that we have the diasporas of these super powerful exiles who are all lobbyists dressed in suits and they can manipulate home country politics and sort of meddle and be the puppet masters of what's going on at home, I think is erroneous and overstated. And I would say that particularly in the Middle Eastern case, I should also mention that people abroad have massive challenges in terms of getting resources home due to the war on terror, which is ongoing in the way that it profiles Arab and Muslim Americans, Britons, and other people around the world for sending, even basic humanitarian aid back to their home countries. So a lot of times people, if they don't have an accredited way to get resources home, they're oftentimes afraid to remit to social or political causes because they're worried they're going to be accused of aiding terrorism, and that could have huge ramifications for them and their families. So I will say it's also incumbent on home, sort of host country governments to make sure that people do have a way to channel their resources to these places that can make a difference without penalizing them for doing so. Because right now you can send just about any kind of aid you want to Ukraine, right? Particularly as a white American, but Yemeni Americans, even to send money home to their families to buy food or to pay for fuel might be at risk. And that's obviously completely wrong. So we need to be also thinking about who these diasporas are and that they're not all equally advantaged to, intervene at all times in their homelands. Yeah, so just to recap, I would say diaspora activism is a very important, it's not necessarily new, but it's been fueled by, this rise of this global technology infrastructure. And so again, diasporas can in certain times and places be very powerful in their home countries. But and we assume even from the Iraq case, for example, that lobbyists abroad, can really help to overthrow authoritarian governments. if they have the right friends, in the United States government. But again, I would say one of the main claims of the book is that this is overstated, and particularly for diasporas from authoritarian states. They really only have certain chances and opportunities to try to make a difference in terms of regime change or addressing humanitarian crises, in particular because they're impacted by transnational repression, differential resources, a very stratified geopolitical system that gives attention to some actors and not others, and also because they fight amongst themselves, which is another issue I call conflict transmission. I mean, people, just because they're all part of the same diaspora doesn't mean they all get along and they agree on what should be done about said authoritarian regime. And so at the end of the book, what I really encourage readers to think about is social movements and revolutions as transnational phenomena. I don't think it can be underestimated how important the Arab Spring revolutions, or whatever one prefers to call them, that they be understood as having globalized effects, as really helping diasporas to feel empowered, to become actors again, whereas a lot of times they were too repressed or afraid to do so. And I think it's also very important for us to understand that yes, globalization has fueled these kinds of connections and sometimes can fuel transnational activism, but it's not the same for everyone. And we certainly see that Libyan, Syrians, and Yemenis have faced abroad different sets of advantages and only had very slim windows with which to intervene during these uprisings. So I hope that this book will be useful to activists. I hope that it will be interesting to scholars of transnationalism and globalization. And I hope that it helps us to think about the roles of diasporas in home country crises, and to really better specify the conditions under which they can contribute and the conditions under which they can't. Because again, if we only look at really positive cases of diaspora mobilization, we're going to say, wow, look at the Lebanese, look at the Armenians, look at Israel supporting Jewish Americans, right? They're hugely influential in the home country. But we also need to look at other cases, including negative cases. We need to understand how this mobilization changes over time. And so I hope I've done a little bit to provide some insights into that, and also especially raise awareness about transnational repression, because it is a growing threat across the globe, given the rise of authoritarianism at the global level and the sort of shrinking spaces for sanctuary that people in exile, refugees have, and Middle Eastern and North African communities, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope no dictator gets his hand on the book, especially the transnational repression part.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Moss, for coming on the podcast and for sharing your research and your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abdullah, for having me. It was truly an honor.
Likewise.